Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Uh, my name is Prashant Kumar, and welcome to the Reclaim Network Plus webinar series. So this is our webinar number 12. So Reclaim is a Network Plus project which is funded by the GCARE, that includes the Engineering and Physical Research Council, Natural Environment Research Council, and Arts and Humanities Research Council, and there are 5 partners involved in the project, which includes Surrey, Bangor, Bath, and UKCH, and the Warwick, of course. So these are the list of our investigators and co-investigators. They bring the diverse set of expertise in the area. We have been supported by our network manager. We got Mark Simmons and Salat and a network fellow, GCARE. We've been doing pretty well. So currently we got over 480 members, and this member base is growing, and that's been represented from over 45 countries. So the whole idea of this webinar series that is started in the very beginning of this network was to bring the different cohort of people that includes the practitioners, young researchers, academics, the SMEs and the businesses, to talk about their experience in the research in the domain of the green, blue, and gray infrastructure. This is a monthly seminar, a webinar series, which happens every Wednesday between 12:30 and 13:30 p.m. You can find actually the recordings of all these webinars on our YouTube channel. So we'll post that in the in the link. These webinars are some of them are solicited, so we approach the researchers or whoever are working in this particular area. But then there is also an open invitation, so you can see the barcode there, or you can just write to us if you are interested to be a speaker, and we will present you the options for choosing a slot. So today we got 2 researchers, speakers with us. So the one is María. She's from the University of Sheffield, and currently she's working at the University of Cambridge in Grantham Center for Sustainable Futures, and she'll be talking about the nature-based solutions to mitigate air pollution in a school playground. And our second speaker is Dr.habil Inostroza, and he is coming from the Mendel University in Brno, and he will be talking about the sustainabilities of the cities. So before I go further, so there are some housekeeping notes. So you are welcome to ask questions. So please use the Q&A chat box. You can write your questions, and you can write your name and affiliation if you want us to speak with your question. And our question and answer session will be chaired by my colleague, Professor Lawrence Jones. So he will read your questions to the speakers, and that will be held towards the end of these 2 webinars, 2 talks basically. So each talk will be 20 minutes, and we will go one by one, and then we'll take the question and answer session. This webinar is recorded, so you can also see those webinars on our YouTube channel. So we'll put a link in there, so you can watch this later on, or can share with your colleagues, but can also look at the other webinars we have in the past. So without further ado, I'm gonna introduce to our first speaker. She was born and raised in Mexico City, Dr. María del Carmen Redondo, Bermúdez. Sorry if I didn't pronounce your name properly, María. She's a multidisciplinary scientist interested in creating fair and livable cities that incorporates nature. She worked as a consultant after studying for a BEng in environment engineering. She also holds a MSc in applied ecology from a joint Erasmus Mundus program of the European Commission. She has recently been awarded a PhD in landscape architecture with a specialization in nature-based solutions and clean air. So over to you, María.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me just start sharing my screen. There we go. So yes, today we're going to be speaking about a nature-based solution, a green infrastructure that has reduced air pollution in a school playground in Sheffield, here in the UK. This research is part of my PhD doctoral research in the past 4 years that I did at the University of Sheffield in the Department of Landscape Architecture, and it was funded by the Grantham Centre for Sustainable Futures. And why, speaking of air pollution, as it was mentioned, I grew up in Mexico City, and some days Mexico City looks beautiful. It's a massive, great city that can be very sunny and beautiful, just like this picture. But some other days it looks like this. Well, it barely looks like, you cannot really see what's going on because of that deep smog layer of air pollution. And growing up as a kid there meant that in days with high pollution like this one, we were not able, or we were not allowed to play outside. We had to stay indoors in the classroom, and that was very frustrating, very disappointing for a child to want to go out and have fun, but cannot do it because of the high levels of pollution. But what the Mexican government was trying to do was preventing us as children to feel the effects, the really harmful effects of air pollution. And that is because air pollution definitely affects more the children. They are more susceptible because their bodies are still not mature, because they breathe more air per unit body weight. And in fact, children are born with a structure in the lungs that is not fully developed. So they are born with 20% of the structure alveoli, and they have to reach that 100% throughout the years. And for that, they need a healthy, clean environment that supports them into doing so. Failing to have that kind of environment may lead to poor lung function, asthma, and air pollution is even related to cognitive impairment in children. So a potential solution for being able to play outside during high pollution days or during any kind of pollution days, but adapted to a UK environment, is the use of green barriers. Green barriers as a physical and biological barrier to separate the pollution sources and the space where children play. In this case, we're talking of a school playground. And the pollution source is traffic, mainly here in the UK in this kind of context, cars exhaust, and also particulate matter from the tear and wear of the different brakes and wheels and parts of the car. And by green barrier, I mean the use of different types of plants. It can be climbers, it can be trees, it can be shrubs, whatever is put together in a defined line and structure to help us with certain mechanisms reduce pollution. And that is one, that plants can block away airflow that has pollutants, acting essentially as a physical barrier, but they also can be filters of pollutants. For instance, with particulate matter, when we have this flow of pollutants that go through a plant, the different structures, the leaves, the bark, capture these particles and they get deposited on these structures. But additionally, regarding the gases, the car's exhaust, toxic gases can be absorbed, taken into the plant by a structure on the leaves surface. So there's different ways that plants can help us to remove pollutants. For this particular study, we chose a school in Sheffield, and that yellow triangle shows specifically the location of the playground. it is surrounded really close by streets. It's a commercial and residential area that is very close to roundabouts leading to the main city. So there's cars and traffic going on around all the time. We work together with the school and with many other actors to being able to design, build, and measure pollution. To design and build the green barrier and then to measure pollution in the playground. We had different meetings with the school community, with head teachers, parent governors, other teachers, but also with experts from landscape architecture, civil engineers, and a construction company, all of whom gave their in-kind services and came together to produce this. So we planned everything, designed everything, had a really open conversation on what was possible and what was not possible. And then finally had volunteers from all the sectors, from the university, the school, and the different industries who came together and planted this green barrier. And that's a picture of one of the planting days, because it took several days to create this barrier around the school. We finally installed it in October 2019 using an ivy fence all along the playground, 3 different types of conifers, bamboo, and different shrubs and ground cover species that gave seasonal interest, color interest, texture, but also could help us to capture this pollutant. It is 60 meters long, 2.40 meters high, and it's quite thin, thinking of this being an inner city school. So we didn't have much time, we didn't have the luxury of have a 5-meter green barrier or something like that, which the literature says that is more effective at reducing pollutants. But in real life, we may not have those situations. So having a thin green barrier, multi-species, is the thing that we wanted to test in real life. Here are other pictures of the playground with the plants in. We see the bamboo in the corner, some of the conifers, the ivy, the different plants. And after installation and before as well, we measured air quality in the playground, outside the playground, and also compared it with other sites across the city of Sheffield. In terms of the results, speaking of nitrogen dioxide, one of these car exhaust gases, we saw a significant reduction in pollution. So what you're seeing here, it's 3 different periods that we are comparing. After 2019, unfortunately, we had different lockdowns due to COVID-19. So I want to show you how that first lockdown period compared to later in the following 2 years, the levels of pollution. The school playground, well, actually across the whole city of Sheffield, pollution, nitrogen dioxide, decreased. Specifically in the playground, it decreased by 25%. And that made sense because there were no cars, there were less sources of nitrogen dioxide across the city. However, when things start getting more normal and pollution and cars movement picked up, then we saw that in other places in the city, this is the city center, and this is another school that did not have a green barrier, pollution kind of returned to those previous levels, but it was not the same for the school with the green barrier. Pollution actually remained lower compared to those other cities, to those other places in the city. That happened in 2020, and the same happened in 2021, being the green barrier where the school playground where the green barrier was much lower in pollution. In fact, our results without the influence of the weather say that in 2021, nitrogen dioxide was 13% lower compared to baseline. And when we take into consideration the weather, we find that 23% pollution was reduced by 23%. On the other hand, regarding particulate matter, results were not as promising. However, they were still statistically significant. We saw a reduction after 2 years in 2021 of 2% of particulate matter. And across the playground, the triangle represents the playground, and then outside some monitoring points and inside some others. Inside the playground, we always saw, when after the green barrier was installed, that pollution was lower compared to the outside, but minimal, let's say, in some ways. At the same time, during lockdowns, during that first lockdown, we saw an increase of particulate matter across the city. In the playground, it was by 21%, but it was similar levels across the city. And then you would be thinking, well, you just said that there were less cars, so pollution should have gotten down. That was not the case, because particulate matter is a very complex pollutant that is very much dependent on the weather. And that was the case. It was really high, pollution was really high across the city. And it didn't really matter that we have this or not. It was everywhere, it was high. Also, during lockdowns, there were other kind of sources of pollution. For example, garden waste burn, and maybe other types of burning with burners, for instance. So things were not as straightforward, but still we saw some little effect on particulate matter due to the green barrier. And in fact, we saw the particles being deposited on the leaves. We took some of these leaves that were part of the green barrier and took them to the lab, saw them under the scanning electron microscope. And what I'm showing you here is leaf surface magnified 1,000 times. We saw these white little dots as the particles being deposited on the gray background, which represents the leaf. And it was really interesting to see in which structures they are deposited, how they're captured. We're also able to quantify then which plants were better at capturing particulate matter. And from the species that we tested, we found that the conifer tuya was the one capturing the most particles, followed by the ivy, and then the one that captured the least was black bamboo overall. However, it captured some of the smallest size particles, PM1, which that was really important, because the smaller the particle, the most dangerous it is, as it can travel throughout our bodies, causing harm. So all of them did this filtering effect to some extent, and they were all really valuable to have in the playground. But finally, what was really interesting as well was not only the fact of having some element of pollution reduction using this thin multi-species green barrier, but also all the other benefits that the school community felt and had due to the integration of this greenery in the playground. We did a survey and interviewed parents and teachers, and they recognized many other social benefits. For instance, that the school premises felt safer, that it was more pleasurable to be in the playground, the place quality and attractiveness increased, that they felt more calm being away, being apart, not being able to see now the carts going around. Teachers mentioned that there were loads of learning opportunities for children, not only to enhance a part of connection with nature, but also for any subject, maths, nature, biology, art, and that in a way also helped children's development and play. Also the fact that having this greener playground was an opportunity for having a constant green space for children to go and visit, because in cities or anywhere, not every single child may have green space near their house or at their home. So this was definitely a place where they could always have that nature interaction, even though they didn't have it in their own places. And the way we did the project allowed as well for a lot of community engagement, and the school were really interested, really sold into it, own it, and they are now the ones that are maintaining the green bar. People also found some environmental benefits, mainly habitat provisioning for species that now are present there, different types of birds and insects, but also it raised awareness in terms of environmental and sustainable living within the school community. And finally, unintendedly, putting the green bar in the school also had some economical benefits. So there was a lot of interest from parents to enroll their children into this particular school. The interest and school subscription increased because the school was seen as doing something good for children, trying to solve a problem, putting their own effort and time into creating a healthier, cleaner environment for children. And, you know, I think it's not fair to say that schools should have the whole responsibility, because air pollution, it's a very complex and systemic problem, but they doing this for the sake of their own children really help them to put them in a position where parents wanted to be in a school as proactive as this one. And well, that's mainly what I wanted to share with you today, just to take home messages. Coming back as well to the story of me being a kid in Mexico City and not being able to play outside due to pollution. I think that this is a worth exploring alternative to and solution to being able to be in a healthy environment, but also in a realistic way, because cities may not have that luxury of space, but this multi-species thin green barrier did reduce air pollution, and they do have the potential to reduce air pollution further in other kinds of settings and in other kinds of designs and layouts. But more than anything, that air pollution was not only the problem that was to some extent solved by these, but this green barrier has loads of benefits, social, environmental, and economic. And I think it's a great addition for any type of school. And that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. It's very interesting work, and this is quite important as well when it comes to protecting the children's health, especially you know, around the busy roadsides where most of the schools are these days. So I'm sure that the colleagues would have questions for you. So please do not forget to use the Q&A chat box to write your questions, which we'll pick up after this second talk. So I'll take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Luis Inostroza. So he's a senior researcher at the Faculty of Regional Studies and International Development, Mendel University in Brno, where he leads the Urban Ecology Research Lab. He applies statistically, especially explicit quantitative methods based on GIS and remote sensing to analyze the metabolism of socio-ecological systems and their links to ecology and economic functions from a local to global scale. So Luis possesses profound working experience across Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, having published his work in more than 70 scientific journals and presenting at more than 50 international conferences. Luis is an associate editor of Ecosystem Services and editorial board member of Landscape and Urban Planning and reviewer of more than 50 index journals. So Luis is an executive committee member of the Ecosystem Services Partnership, a member of the Society for Urban Ecology, a member of the European Landscape Institute, and a charter member of the Royal Institute of British Architects and IPBES expert. So he speaks fluently in 5 languages. Wow, that's wonderful, Luis. So yeah, without any further ado, so over to you.
You're on mute, Luis.
Thank you very much, Professor Kumar, for the introduction, for inviting me to be here today talking about cities. I will today do something that is not common on my side. Normally, I start from the conceptual approach, and then I move to the more operational approach where I like to measure things. Today, I'm going to be doing an experiment which is upside down, basically to try to show you first with empirical evidence that cities are basically unsustainable and that we're facing far bigger problems than we normally think. And for that, if I can move this thing, I will be dividing this in 4 parts. I cannot go into details because I have to be rushing, so I'm going to be on the surface. But I hope that with the questions, we can go and dive a little bit deeper. If each slide is basically, a complete research line that can be explained in full detail. So in the first part, I'm going to talk about the urban that we think we know. Then I'm going to focus in the second part on empirical evidence, looking at 3 research lines that we have been developing during the last 12 years: urban expansion of form, urban heat island, and informal urban development. And then I'm going to sum up those things in terms of what is the sustainability conundrum that those 3 things they place together that we require for that, a paradigmatic change in the way we understand cities. That's my point. So here just some pictures about cities, things that sometimes we agree, we look at those things and we are clear that this is an urban thing. Sometimes we move to small things and then there's a lot of debate whether this thing can be urban or not. This is a small settlement of like 200 inhabitants somewhere in southern Patagonia, my home region. And in the cases, we are clearly that this cannot be called urban, at least for most of the people working on these issues. In cases when we find abandoned places or linked to economic activities, also we might agree that these things are not urban. But the urban concept that we are applying is basically a demographic one that came from Kingsley Davis in the 50s, trying to propose a way to summarize basically a global demographics. So when we say now that population in the planet is more than 50% urban, we are talking about basically a demographic phenomenon. This demographic phenomenon, it has been built upon an arbitrary assumption that there is a particular threshold of population that can divide basically what is urban from what it is not. In some cases, like in India, for instance, the threshold is 100,000 inhabitants. In some of the cases, like in Chile, for instance, it's 2,000 or 500,000 inhabitants, and so forth. So therefore, that leads to a very confusing description of what it is urban for us nowadays. What we call basically this urban-rural dichotomy, where the things are urban or rural in a very categorical way. When we actually pay attention to the space and time, what we see is a continuous thing. In the space, you can clearly see a gradient from city centers to hinterlands. And also, if you consider time, you also see a very continuous process. That it is actually not reflected in that demographic understanding of urbanization as a process. So what is the empirical evidence that we have about this spatiotemporal continuity? The first thing is that cities are indeed growing structures. They do develop in time in a very clear way, sometimes even going into the ocean at very fast rates. This is, for instance, Santa Cruz de la Sierra in Bolivia. Here you have more or less 20 years of development. If you summarize that in a rate per minute, you have 17 square meters per minute. This is the case of Santiago de Chile. 24 square meters per minute during the last 20 years. This is the case of Buenos Aires, 57.6 square meters per minute. And there is also a very interesting correlation between the size of the core of the city and the speed, which is stronger than the correlation with population. The bigger the city, the faster it will develop, even if it sometimes can be losing population. And the losing population debate has been also very important during the last decades. We have here the shrinking cities map, that cities, they're supposed to shrink, but that is again a demographic concept. Here you have the evidence from the most emblematic shrinking city in Germany, at least, which is Leipzig. And here you have again the picture of urban expansion in the last 10, 20 years. And then you see that even losing population, as you can see clearly here in the numbers, minus 0.63%, it expanded a really fast rate of 41.4 square meters per minute. All over the world, cities are growing structures, and it is possible to see in a very physical way. And this physical way is something that I would like to emphasize. When you look at the European continent in the last 100 years, you're going to find that the pace of expansion of urban systems was 1,507 square meters per minute. And this is, of course, linked with a very particular material consumption that you see in this little graph down here, where construction materials have been growing at exponential rate. In Germany, for instance, that meant that only in 2010, 15 billion tons of anthropogenic materials were accumulated in the space. The second research line I want to show some little empirical evidence is a global urban heat. Here you have a map of cities. So basically what we know is that cities around the globe are warming up. This phenomenon is called urban heat island. This is an emerging global scale problem that it emerges through the change in land cover. So urban land covers, normally they heat up urban environments. So when you find green, as Maria was showing us, normally the environment tends to be cooler. But if you put anthropogenic materials, pavement, buildings, etc., it's going to start to warm up. We were doing some exercise of including the time dimension in seeing how those patterns are basically distributed in a city. And then we found that there are places where you find a very warming hotspot. Let's say that in time is a hotspot that is increasing the temperature, while there are some others that is no trend or might be steady in terms of time. The third line I want to show now is global informality. Here you have a map of informal urban development all over the world in the 5 continents. More or less 43% of the people in the global south, they live in informal settlements. In Latin America, this accounts for 40% of the population living there. Informal urban development means that basically there is no infrastructure, it's an unfinished building process, bad quality materials, spontaneous development without planning, dirty roads are proceeding here in this case building process, and normally they are also located in very vulnerable locations, prone to natural hazards. Interesting thing about informal urban development is there is a kind of very clear urban polarization where this unequal distribution of quality materials, they take place actually at very close distances. This picture, for instance, is Buenos Aires, and then here you see the rich district in the red square and the very poor district in the yellow square, and then you see that the proximity is really, really high. Nowadays, we understand informal urban development in a linear sense, from arrival, living, entitling, and incremental upgrading. And then when we look at the evidence, basically, we realize that the trajectories of individual families in a material sense are very different. And therefore, we are proposing here a model that, including the time, can even show some interbreeding behaviors. Let's say some people that can be entitled and therefore get out of informality, and then after a certain time falls back again in an informal situation. So a linear model, current understanding for an interbreeding model where there is basically time symmetry. The three research lines I was showing, they are considering as very important the aspect of time. In the case of expansion, when you add the time, there is the inevitable consequence of looking at what the expansion is made of. In this case, it's made of materials. Materials are accumulated, and they have several environmental impacts. Heat is one of them, informality is another of them, energy demand is another of them, pollution is also one of them. This pace of expansion can be, let's say, represented with the metaphor of the impossible hamster, with a hamster who's doubling the weight each week, its own weight, no? So basically, after several weeks, the size of the hamster, it could be greater than the total annual amount of maize produced in the entire worldwide. So this metaphor is basically saying us that a physical structure like hamster or like a city cannot continue expanding forever. There are physical limits for that, which is basically shown in this graph. So in 1 year, we will have a hamster weighing 9 billion tons, basically. You know? To measure these things, including time and in an ecological way, we are using an indicator that we call technomass, which is similar to biomass, measuring the amount of materials accumulated per unit of surface and time. And that helps us to understand cities as ecosystems, basically, where you see particular rates of growth in terms of biomass or technomass, and that's produced particular rates of productivity, which is P, net or gross, and also particular rates of respiration, which is rate. Indeed, air pollution can be basically understood as an outcome of this metabolism, which is a function basically of the rate of accumulation of the growing structure of the materials, basically. The interesting thing when we look at natural ecosystem, this is the replication of a forest ecosystem, is that there is a point, which is here shown by the red line, when growth stops. There is no more growing of the physical structure of the ecosystem, but development continues. And development here, it means increasing in complexity, basically closing energy and material cycles. Cities are growing structures. They have also this interlink between growing patterns of technomass and biomass in the form of urban expansion, which is producing an expansion in the agricultural boundary, basically. So this is very interesting empirical evidence that for every square meter increase in an urban area, there is an increase in agricultural area that is sometimes 1 order of magnitude bigger, what we call the expansion axis. In this case, 10% increase in arable land per capita is associated with 2% increase in urban land cover. And cities also, they have densification. When we look at these patterns in the sense of energy demand, there is also a superlinearity. So the more materials you have, the more heat you accumulate in the urban environment. Here you have evidence from 4 cities where you can see that there is basically a 1-to-1 growth, which is linear until a certain threshold, which is around 30,000 tons per hectare. And after that, the energy demand increases exponentially. So basically, when we look at those patterns in terms of heat, in terms of energy demand, it's clearly it's basically super clear to see that the problem of energy in cities is not basically demand of energy. Energy is available. If you look at the sun, for instance, here, the amount of energy coming from the sun is sufficient, basically, to sustain our development for at least 500 years. The problem is that all the energy that we consume has to be dissipated. And for that, cities have very limited capacity. And our hypothesis is basically that the urban heat island that you see as a spread phenomenon all over the world is basically showing the increasing problems that cities have in dissipating that basically that heat. And this, of course, produces an important increase in terms of vulnerability patterns, especially of certain population that is becomes vulnerable to those patterns. No? Something that we have calculated also in an empirical work in some cities. Link again to certain particular aspects of material dwellings. The reflection here is basically that we have to move from our understanding of cities to see them as a phenomenon taking place in time. Here I would like to make the analogy with the research on the body. In the beginning, we were researching dead bodies, basically looking inside and understanding them and seeing a lot of interesting things that allow actually medicine to develop. But basically now we are looking at living bodies, no? Seeing the full picture. And then for that reason, understanding better how human body works. So in that case, we move from a dead body to an alive body. And it's exactly the same thing that we have to do urgently in urban research, to include time as a fundamental component in all the analysis we do. In many cases, this is not the case, unfortunately, and we are just looking at one picture and one particular moment of time and not considering what are the changes that can be produced when you are looking at this in a more complex way. The second thing is that cities are basically continuous process where there is not such a thing as a dichotomy between the natural and the social. This is also very much related with the way that ecosystem services understanding systems, basically in the way of co-production. Human interaction is always necessary to produce the services that we basically enjoy. So we are agents of our own benefits in that sense, and that's a paradigmatic change. And the third one is that cities are basically not an object, like here in the case of Brasilia. This is a paradigmatic case of Lucio Costa, won several prizes. It's Brasilia designed in the 50s. For the authors, this was an airplane, but basically cities are rather processes than objects, no? That requires a paradigmatic change in the way we plan urban systems. So basically that means to change this perspective of control of urban form, basically for guiding processes that are basically taking place through this interaction between biomass and technomass. Design disciplines are still a bit far from that. This is some design competition done, I think, by RIBA, yeah, where cities here you see are floating on the air, etc. And I think that design also requires some reframing of the understanding of what are the real problems to be solved. And in other cases, when we have some evidence, like in the case of climate, sometimes the arguments are also a bit strong in the sense of proof cities against climate. That seems also a bit unfeasible, especially nowadays. And finally, in terms of replicability, of science, this dichotomy that is based on a categorical understanding of what it is urban, it is in a pretty scientific way, in the sense that it is not really understanding the urban phenomenon in a continuous way, and therefore is dramatically affecting our capacity to compare, to do comparative urban research in different places in the world. So to move from a categorical understanding to a continuous understanding of the urban phenomenon can allow us basically to build a real urban science. So from categorical to a continuous one. And with this and the inclusion of time, we can basically start to think to make real this promise of circular economy, which is basically closing the energy material cycles within urban processes, taking from the output back to the input in terms of matter and energy. I think that that's all. Thank you very much for your attention. If you just allow me one little announcement, we are organizing the conference Ecosystem Services Partnership in Chile this year in November from 6 to 10. So please save the date. The conference is going to be bilingual, English and Spanish, hybrid format, and the call for abstract is open until 15 of July. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Lawrence to take over this question and answer session.
Okay, so thank you both for two very interesting talks. And just while we're sort of starting on questions, so there's a few questions for Maria, but if you can have a think of some questions to pose to Luis as well, that would be great. So I'm not going to take these in order. I'm going to badge them a bit, just in the interest of time. So there's sort of two related questions for Maria. One is around, did you just measure NO2 in PM? And then following on from that, could you just expand a little bit more on why you think the green barrier was effective at reducing NOx concentrations, but not PM?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we measured nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter, but also we monitored ozone, because ozone and nitrogen dioxide are interrelated pollutants. I didn't show those results, but it is not such a big problem of a pollutant here in the UK, whilst in other countries like in Mexico or in the US, for instance, it is. However, ozone causes damage on plants, so it's not really that you could solve reducing concentrations using plants. But I think for this particular case that the green barrier was good at reducing nitrogen dioxide, because I believe it was acting more of a physical barrier rather than a biological barrier, like deflecting pollution and deflecting that airflow rather than filtering. It was definitely filtering particulate matter, and we saw it with the scanning electron microscope. But potentially that deflecting effect was bigger because of the position, the layout of the playground, where the sources of pollution were located, and where how the airflow was moving across the playground.
Just a quick follow-on question from me. So when you measured NOx, did you measure NO and NO2 separately? Yes,
separately, but I focused mainly on NO2.
Okay. I'll ask you a second question, and then I'll come on to some questions for Louise. So there's a question about where you got the sort of inspiration and the materials to actually build the green barrier. So the question is essentially, did you get that, were those bespoke products that you could buy, or did you have to design it, pick the species, design and build the whole structure yourself?
A little bit of both. First of all, I did a literature review and tried to understand which species were out there already being researched that can reduce pollution. But also, there's so many species in the world, there's so many different types of plants that even if research says this is a good plant, maybe that is because it's the only plant that has been researched. Maybe there's other 1,000 plants that could do the same, we just don't know. So based on the literature, I focused more on the different physical characteristics that plants should have to reduce pollution. And based on that, then we, working with a landscape architect, designing it from scratch, we decided which plants would be good in this particular scenario, like, you know, in the very limited space that we have, just 1 meter for growing these plants, and having some low level of maintenance, because this is school who's going to take care of it in the long term. So it was a combination of several things. These characteristics that are good for reducing pollution, the plants that were available and suitable for the space, and for the ongoing maintenance, and also, to be honest, what is available out there. So if you have this amazing design, then we went to the nurseries and they said, well, we don't have this species, neither this species, neither this species. So you have to be also, that's why I like this project, it's very practical. We had to be as well objective and very practical in terms of like what could be done in real conditions and just can't because those plants are not available, don't exist, or things like that. So it was a combination of all of those, but yeah, it was our own design for the space and in terms of the plant species.
Okay, thank you very much. That's really, really clear. So Luis, it's the first time I've seen a city compared to a hamster. That's a great analogy. You talked a lot about the challenges, and a lot of it is around sort of form and change over time. So to me, that kind of suggests that there's a very strong role in planning, both in terms of sort of dealing with challenges, but also thinking about the future. So I wonder if you could perhaps expand on that a bit, but specifically with the focus of nature-based solutions and green infrastructure.
Basically, I think that what we require is empirical evidence, as Maria has been showing. If you think, for instance, in the review that basically we are doing, I've been actually working on similar review already for 2 or 3 years. The evidence that we have about benefits of green areas that all of us, we agree. I mean, green areas are super, are good and necessary, etc. But when you want to look in the numbers, then you run into problems, no? Because numbers have been very elusive. We ourselves, we have empirical tried attempts of linking health benefits to aspects of urban form at larger scale, let's say for an entire city, and the results are very inconclusive, very much. And then basically you realize that what is missing is a better conceptualization, linking the way you understand cities in an operational way from those benefits. So for instance, let's say things that how you understand urban form, how you understand urban green, how you measure that. You're going to be measuring that based on NDVI, you're going to be measuring that based on square meters per inhabitant, based on the threshold of 300 meters. And every time you take one of those operational decisions to measure a phenomenon, then basically the way you're understanding the phenomenon changes. And looking at all that evidence during the last years and trying to link those things with planning, then I realized that basically what we are missing is more like basic research, you know? Basic research like what Maria is doing, something I love to do. I mean, it's like to go there and put sensors and then see, I mean, how much of SOx, NOx, etc. are being captured by this or that particular species in this particular context. And then to see to what extent we can make general statements about that. The only basically thing that so far, I mean, if there is some value basically in the things I brought today is that you can take any of the three things I mentioned, expansion, informality, and urban heat, and the patterns I show, I'm sorry for showing you so superficial, but you can put it, you give me the city and I show you the patterns. Those are general patterns, basically, regularities that all systems basically are showing. And I think that we need more than that, rather than idiosyncratic research focusing on the singularities of particular places that are not replicable or they're not informing other places in other parts.
Okay, and I guess a follow-on question related to that is why, you know, if cities have got shrinking populations, why do they still expand physically? Why does the footprint still expand?
I think that there are basically like two facts. The first is that if you understand that expansion in a land cover sense, now it's a physical process. Now you have a piece of land that it was sealed. That's a very persisting. It's very persisting because it took an investment basically to make that change, and that change most likely will remain there, and it's driven by economic forces basically. Cities with a shrinking population, they have vacancies of 15 to 20% of the stock of housing, for instance, where Airbnb is thriving. You know, so things like that. I mean, there are economic forces shaping those cities behind. And every change we do is basically remaining there. I mean, if you look even Chernobyl looks exactly the same as look in the 85 when the reactor exploded. There have been no shrinking in Chernobyl or abandoned cities in Spain or in Italy. There's no shrinking, physically speaking, but rather a force for investment and to keep this build capital in conditions, basically.
In some ways, there's the potential there, perhaps, in cities with shrinking populations, that there's more opportunities, perhaps, to bring on green infrastructure within the city rather than inside it.
Yes, could be more opportunities.
Okay, I think we're running close to time, so Prashant, shall I hand over to you to close?
Yeah, we just get 2 minutes basically. So are you done with the question answer? So I think I could possibly take an opportunity to introduce to our next webinar speaker. So that will be our webinar number 13 on 7th of June. And we have a speaker, Dr. Andrea Berardi. He's coming from Cobra Collective CIC, and he'll be talking about the GBGA participatory co-design approach. And Andrea was also one of our the Reclaim Network's secondee, so he took in secondment with a council. And the second speaker would be Julian Dick. She'll be talking about the place-based approaches using nature-based solutions. So very interesting webinar. So please make a note in your diary. If you're not a member of the network, then please you can visit the website called the reclaim-network.org. We just launched the new membership form there, so you can fill your details there and you will get all the information. And if you are on the Twitter, then you can follow us on the Twitter as well as on the LinkedIn. But if you have any questions about the webinars or anything related to Reclaim, please use the email called info@reclaim-network.org, which is attended by our team, mostly the Mark Siemens and Charlotte and myself and others. So we've been working on that. So thank you very much for your time, and all the speakers, especially both of you, Luis and Maria. And in the background, there's a lot of work done by Charlotte and Mark. So thank you everyone for all your hard work for getting this webinar series running. So we will share the YouTube link for this webinar, and we'll look forward to see you in our next webinar. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.